In the bitter cold of 9,500 years before Christ, a woman named Ashara crouched in the shadows of the Zagros Mountains, watching her children grow thin as winter stretched longer than any elder could remember. The younger Dryas had turned the once generous earth into a frozen wasteland where even the heartiest hunters returned empty-handed. While her tribe debated whether to venture further north or south in search of game, Ashara noticed something others had missed: tiny green shoots pushing through disturbed soil where they had camped 3 moons earlier. That night, while others slept, she conducted her first experiment. Using a sharpened antler, she scratched shallow furrows in the earth and carefully placed wild wheat seeds she had been collecting for years as the tribe's plant knowledge keeper. Her grandmother had taught her which seeds would grow into food, which would heal, and which would kill, but no one had ever tried to command where they would grow. The tribal elder discovered her midnight work and declared it blasphemy against the spirits who provided for them. When Ashara's small patch produced twice the grain of any wild stand, he accused her of dark sorcery. The tribe split violently. Her supporters, mostly women who understood the grinding daily struggle of finding enough plant food to supplement unreliable hunting, faced off against traditionalist hunters who saw farming as an insult to their ancestors. The confrontation erupted into the first agricultural revolution, not through gentle persuasion, but through desperate hunger, when the hunters failed to bring meat for 20 straight days. Ashara's stored grain, hidden in clay-lined pits she had learned to construct through patient experimentation, became the difference between starvation and survival. By spring, 17 families had joined her permanent settlement near the planted fields. They built the world's first agricultural village using mud bricks dried in the sun, creating circular houses with shared walls for protection against both weather and raiders. The strategic placement on a hill overlooking the valley gave them warning when hostile nomadic bands approached, drawn by rumors of stored food. These early farmer warriors defended their revolution with obsidian-tipped spears and an unshakable belief that controlling food production meant controlling destiny itself. So, here's what happened next. 500 years had passed since Ashara's first seeds, and by 9,000 before Christ, agricultural villages dotted the landscape from the Mediterranean coast to the Persian plateau. Her descendants had discovered that selecting the largest seeds from the strongest plants year after year created grain heads so heavy they could no longer spread naturally. Wheat and barley had become dependent on human hands for survival, just as humans had become dependent on them. This mutual bondage would define the next 10,000 years of human history. The domestication of animals revolutionized farming beyond anything Ashara could have imagined. Wild aurochs, ancestors of modern cattle, were first lured with grain surplus, then penned, then bred for docility over generations until they became living tools. A single ox pulling a wooden plough could prepare more land in a day than 20 people with digging sticks. Sheep and goats, originally kept for meat, became walking factories, producing milk, wool, and fertilizer that enriched depleted soils. The combination of plants and animals created an agricultural system that could support 50 times more people per square mile than hunting and gathering ever could. But paradise came with serpents. The close proximity to animals brought devastating new diseases: smallpox from cattle, influenza from pigs, tuberculosis from goats. Entire villages would die in days from plagues that hadn't existed when humans lived in small, mobile bands. The stored grain attracted rats and mice, bringing more disease and destroying precious food supplies. Farmers developed shorter statures and weaker bones than their hunter ancestors, their teeth rotting from grain-heavy diets. Women, bearing children every 2 years instead of every 4 like nomadic mothers, saw their health deteriorate even as population exploded. Now we need to talk about how the social fabric transformed completely. Land became the first true wealth, passed from father to son in patriarchal lines that replaced the egalitarian structures of hunting bands. Women, once equal partners in gathering, became property tied to agricultural inheritance. The first slaves appeared, captured hunters forced to work fields they didn't own. Warrior classes emerged to protect accumulated wealth, fed by farmer taxation paid in grain. The seeds of inequality that would plague humanity forever had been planted alongside the wheat and barley. 500 years had passed since Ashara's first seeds, and by 9000 before Christ, agricultural villages dotted the landscape from the Mediterranean coast to the Persian plateau. Her descendants had discovered that selecting the largest seeds from the strongest plants year after year created grain heads so heavy they could no longer spread naturally. Wheat and barley had become dependent on human hands for survival, just as humans had become dependent on them. This mutual bondage would define the next 10,000 years of human history. The domestication of animals revolutionized farming beyond anything Ashara could have imagined. Wild aurochs, ancestors of modern cattle, were first lured with grain surplus, then penned, then bred for docility over generations until they became living tools. A single ox pulling a wooden plough could prepare more land in a day than 20 people with digging sticks. Sheep and goats, originally kept for meat, became walking factories producing milk, wool, and fertilizer that enriched depleted soils. The combination of plants and animals created an agricultural system that could support 50 times more people per square mile than hunting and gathering ever could. But paradise came with serpents. The close proximity to animals brought devastating new diseases: smallpox from cattle, influenza from pigs, tuberculosis from goats. Entire villages would die in days from plagues that hadn't existed when humans lived in small, mobile bands. The stored grain attracted rats and mice, bringing more disease and destroying precious food supplies. Farmers developed shorter statures and weaker bones than their hunter ancestors, their teeth rotting from grain-heavy diets. Women, bearing children every 2 years instead of every 4 like nomadic mothers, saw their health deteriorate even as population exploded. Now we need to talk about how the social fabric transformed completely. Land became the first true wealth, passed from father to son in patriarchal lines that replaced the egalitarian structures of hunting bands. Women, once equal partners in gathering, became property tied to agricultural inheritance. The first slaves appeared, captured hunters forced to work fields they didn't own. Warrior classes emerged to protect accumulated wealth, fed by farmer taxation paid in grain. The seeds of inequality that would plague humanity forever had been planted alongside the wheat and barley. By 8000 before Christ, the agricultural transformation had reached a point of no return. Villages had grown into towns with populations numbering in the thousands. Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey housed 10,000 people in densely packed mud brick homes built so close together that residents entered through holes in their roofs. The streets themselves had disappeared. The entire settlement became one massive interconnected structure where neighbors literally walked across each other's rooftops. This wasn't just a new way of living, it was a complete reimagining of human space and community. Psychological shift was equally profound. For the first time in human existence, people could see the direct results of their labor stretching into the future. Plant a field in spring, harvest it in fall, store grain in summer, eat it in winter. This predictability created the concept of planning, not just for tomorrow or next week, but for next year and the year after that. Hunter-gatherers lived in an eternal present, where the next meal depended on luck and skill in roughly equal measure. Farmers lived in a structured future where their actions today determined their survival months away. So here's what this meant for human culture. Religion transformed from animistic worship of nature spirits to organized cults centered on fertility and harvest. The first temples appeared, not modest shrines but massive stone structures requiring hundreds of workers and years of construction. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built around 9500 before Christ, features carved pillars weighing 16 tons each, decorated with intricate reliefs of animals. This wasn't the work of desperate farmers barely surviving. This was surplus wealth converted into permanent monuments to agricultural gods. The invention of pottery around 7000 before Christ revolutionized food storage and preparation. Clay vessels could hold liquids without leaking, store grain without attracting as many pests, and, most importantly, could be placed directly in fire for cooking. This meant grains could be boiled into porridges and gruels that were easier to digest, especially for young children and elderly people. Pottery also enabled fermentation on a scale never before possible. Beer and wine production began not as recreational drinks but as methods of preserving calories and making water safer to drink. Asterisk, asterisk. But here's the dark side that nobody talks about enough. The agricultural surplus that enabled all this civilization also enabled something else, APA, systematic violence on an APA, unprecedented scale. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a dramatic increase in traumatic injuries, especially to skulls. Mass graves appear containing dozens of bodies with similar wounds, suggesting organized warfare rather than individual conflicts. The first fortification walls were built around 6500 before Christ, surrounding entire settlements with massive stone barriers. You don't build walls that thick unless you're genuinely afraid of your neighbors. Trade networks emerged as villages specialized in different products. Obsidian from Anatolia traveled hundreds of miles to become cutting tools in the Levant. Shells from the Mediterranean appeared in settlements deep inland. This wasn't casual gift exchange between friendly neighbors. This was systematic commerce, requiring record-keeping, standardized measures, and the beginnings of what we'd recognize as economic systems. Some settlements became wealthy through strategic location on trade routes, while others remained poor despite good farmland. Geography became destiny in ways that had never mattered to mobile hunter-gatherers. The environmental impact was already becoming visible. Deforestation accelerated as farmers cleared land and needed wood for construction and fuel. The first signs of soil exhaustion appeared in areas that had been farmed continuously for generations. Some settlements were abandoned not because of warfare or disease, but because they had literally exhausted the land that sustained them. Farmers responded by developing crop rotation, letting fields lie fallow, and eventually by using animal manure as fertilizer. Innovations driven by ecological crisis rather than abstract science. By 6000 before Christ, agriculture had transformed from Ashara's experimental garden into an irreversible global phenomenon. Humans had passed the point where returning to hunting and gathering was feasible. Populations had grown too large. Specialized skills had become too important, and the knowledge of how to survive as mobile foragers had been forgotten by generations who had never lived that way. The agricultural trap had closed completely. Humans were now committed to farming whether they liked it or not, dependent on crops that were equally dependent on them, locked in a mutual relationship that would define every aspect of life for the next 8,000 years. By 6000 before Christ, agricultural surplus had created something entirely new, specialized craftsmen who had never held a plough. Potters perfected ceramic storage vessels that could preserve grain for years. Metalworkers, freed from food production, discovered that mixing copper with tin created bronze, strong enough for both ploughshares and swords. Scribes developed the first writing systems to track who owed grain to the temple granaries that had become the centers of political power. Mathematics emerged from the need to survey fields after annual floods and calculate how much seed would cover each plot. The great river valleys became cradles of agricultural civilization. In Mesopotamia, massive irrigation projects turned desert into the most productive farmland on earth. Thousands of workers, organized through hierarchical command structures, dug canals that carried Tigris and Euphrates water to fields miles from the rivers. Egypt's farmers learned to read the Nile's floods like a calendar, planting immediately after waters receded to capture rich silt deposits. China's Yellow River Valley saw the development of millet cultivation, while rice farming in the Yangtze Delta created population densities impossible anywhere else. Competition between agricultural centers drove innovation at breakneck speed. The Sumerians invented the wheeled cart to move grain from fields to cities. Egyptians developed the shadoof, a counterweighted lever that could lift water 15 feet, doubling the amount of irrigable land. The Indus Valley civilization created standardized weights and measures, enabling grain trade across thousands of miles. Each innovation sparked counter-innovations as civilizations fought for agricultural supremacy. Wars were no longer raids for resources but campaigns to control the most productive farmland. So here's what happened when writing was invented around 3200 before Christ. The first texts weren't poetry or philosophy, they were accounting records. Clay tablets from Uruk list quantities of barley, numbers of sheep, and amounts of beer rations for workers. Every economic transaction, every tax payment, every temple offering was meticulously recorded in cuneiform script pressed into wet clay. Writing didn't emerge to preserve stories or communicate ideas. It emerged because agricultural economies had become too complex to track through memory alone. The social stratification became extreme. At the top sat priest kings who claimed divine authority over grain distribution. Below them, a class of scribes and administrators managed the complex systems of taxation and storage. Craftsmen and merchants formed a middle tier, while the vast majority remained farmers working land they didn't own, paying taxes in grain they had grown themselves. At the bottom, slaves, AC, war captives and debtors, worked without any rights whatsoever. This hierarchy, born from agricultural surplus, would persist in various forms for millennia. Now we need to talk about how irrigation created both prosperity and vulnerability. The massive canal systems of Mesopotamia required constant maintenance. Silt accumulated, channels needed dredging, and disputes over water allocation sparked conflicts between cities. A single breach in a major canal could devastate dozens of settlements downstream. Centralized authority became necessary not just to build these systems, but to maintain them. Kings who could organize thousands of workers for irrigation projects became indispensable, gaining power that would have been unthinkable in earlier agricultural communities. By 3500 before Christ, agriculture had transformed from survival strategy to the foundation of empire. Babylon's Hanging Gardens demonstrated agricultural excess as pure power display. Egyptian pyramids, built by farmers during flood seasons when fields lay idle, showed what agricultural surplus could achieve. The first professional armies, fed by grain taxes, conquered neighboring lands not for glory but for their fertile soil. Agricultural productivity became destiny. Civilizations with better farming techniques conquered those without, spreading both seeds and servitude across continents. The Code of Hammurabi, written around 1750 before Christ, reveals how thoroughly agriculture had penetrated legal and social structures. Detailed laws regulated irrigation rights, field boundaries, crop failures, and agricultural debt. A farmer who neglected his irrigation duties and caused his neighbor's field to flood faced severe penalties. Agricultural workers had their wages set by law. A harvest laborer earned specific amounts of grain per day. Even marriage contracts included provisions about agricultural property and inheritance. Every aspect of civilized life now revolved around grain production and distribution. Trade transformed from local exchange to international commerce. By 2000 before Christ, grain from Egypt fed populations across the Mediterranean. Mesopotamian dates and barley traveled to the Indus Valley in exchange for cotton and spices. Chinese millet moved along early trade routes that would eventually become the Silk Road. Ships carried amphorae filled with wine and olive oil across the sea. Caravans of camels and donkeys transported grain across deserts. The first truly global economy emerged, built entirely on agricultural surplus and the need to feed growing urban populations. But agricultural empire came with catastrophic risks. When crops failed, entire civilizations collapsed. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 before Christ saw multiple empires disintegrate simultaneously, possibly triggered by a series of droughts that destroyed harvests across the Mediterranean. Cities were abandoned, trade networks dissolved, and populations crashed. The archaeological record shows a dark age, lasting centuries, caused not by invasion or plague, but by the failure of the agricultural systems that sustained complex civilization. Dependency on farming had made humanity powerful but also desperately vulnerable. The environmental consequences were becoming severe. Deforestation had stripped hillsides bare, causing erosion that choked rivers with sediment. Irrigation without proper drainage led to salt accumulation in soil, rendering once productive fields sterile. The Fertile Crescent, birthplace of agriculture, was already showing signs of the desertification that would eventually make much of it barely arable. Farmers had learned to manipulate nature, but not yet to sustain it. The land was being mined rather than cultivated, exploited rather than nurtured, in a pattern that would repeat across every agricultural civilization. The agricultural revolution reached its dark pinnacle around 2000 before Christ, when farming became completely industrialized through slavery. Roman latifundia, vast slave-worked estates, it, produced grain that fed 1 million people in Rome who had never seen a farm. The trans-Saharan slave trade existed primarily to provide agricultural labor for North African grain production. Chinese peasants, bound to land they couldn't leave, worked rice paddies from dawn to dusk to feed armies conquering ever more agricultural territory. What began as one woman's trick to grow more food had evolved into global systems of human bondage. Yet agriculture also enabled humanity's greatest achievements. The grain surplus of Athens fed philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, who laid foundations for Western thought. Chinese agricultural prosperity during the Han Dynasty supported inventors who created paper, the compass, and gunpowder. Islamic agricultural scientists during the medieval warm period developed crop rotation systems that restored soil fertility, enabling populations to grow without destroying their land base. Every human advancement, art, science, literature, architecture, grew from agricultural surplus that freed some humans from food production. The Columbian Exchange of 1500 after Christ proved agriculture's world-changing power once again. Potatoes from Peru prevented European famines. American corn fed African population explosions. Asian rice cultivation techniques transformed American agriculture. Sugarcane, transplanted to the Caribbean, created wealth that funded the Industrial Revolution. The movement of crops between continents in a single generation changed human history more profoundly than 10,000 years of gradual agricultural development. So, here's what we need to understand about the modern transformation. The mechanization of agriculture in the 19th and 20th centuries after Christ changed everything again. A single farmer with a tractor could do the work of 100 farmers with hand tools. Chemical fertilizers, developed from World War I munitions technology, allowed fields to produce beyond natural capacity. Pesticides eliminated crop losses that had plagued farmers since Ashara's time. Hybrid seeds doubled and tripled yields. The Green Revolution of the 1960s prevented predicted famines across Asia and Africa, feeding billions who would have otherwise starved. Asterisk. But the price of this abundance was steep. Industrial agriculture required massive inputs of fossil fuels, TNSTI, for tractors, for fertilizer production, for pesticide manufacturing, for transporting food thousands of miles from farm to table. Monoculture farming, planting single crops across vast areas, made agriculture efficient but ecologically fragile. A single pest or disease could devastate entire regions. The Irish potato famine of 1845 killed 1 million people and drove another million to emigrate, all because farmers had planted genetically identical potatoes vulnerable to the same blight. Now we need to talk about genetic modification, the latest chapter in agriculture's 10,000-year story. In 1994, after Christ, the first genetically modified tomato went to market. Scientists had learned to edit plant DNA directly, inserting genes from bacteria, other plants, even animals to create crops with specific traits. Corn that produces its own pesticide, soybeans resistant to herbicides, rice enriched with vitamin A to prevent blindness in children. The controversy was immediate and intense. Were these Frankenstein foods or humanity's next great agricultural breakthrough? The numbers tell an astonishing story. When Ashara planted her first seeds, Earth supported perhaps 5 million humans, all hunter-gatherers living in small mobile bands. By 1000 before Christ, agriculture had enabled populations to reach 100 million. By 1000 after Christ, 300 million. By 1900 after Christ, 1.6 billion. Today, 8 billion humans depend entirely on agriculture. 99.9% of all humans alive eat food from farms. The hunting and gathering lifestyle that sustained our species for hundreds of thousands of years now supports less than 1/100th of 1% of humanity. Asterisk. The environmental cost has been catastrophic. Agriculture now occupies 38% of Earth's land surface, ASP, an area larger than Africa. Deforestation for farmland destroys habitats and accelerates climate change. Fertilizer runoff creates oceanic dead zones where nothing can live. Pesticides kill beneficial insects along with pests. Topsoil erodes faster than it forms, threatening long-term food security. The very system that feeds humanity is slowly destroying the ecosystems that make feeding humanity possible. We're repeating the mistakes of ancient Mesopotamia, just on a planetary scale. Asterisk. Yet agriculture also offers hope for addressing these crises. Precision farming uses GPS and sensors to apply water and fertilizer only where needed, reducing waste dramatically. Vertical farming in urban warehouses could produce food without occupying precious land. Perennial grains, currently under development, could eliminate the need for annual ploughing that causes erosion. Lab-grown meat might someday reduce the environmental impact of livestock. The same human ingenuity that created industrial agriculture might yet create sustainable agriculture. Today, 7 billion humans depend on agriculture that would amaze and terrify Ashara. Massive combines harvest in hours what took ancient communities months. Genetically modified crops produce yields she couldn't imagine. Chemical fertilizers force Earth to produce beyond natural capacity. Yet the fundamental discovery remains unchanged: Tuham. Controlling where plants grow gives humans power over their own destiny. Every meal eaten, every civilization built, every human born beyond the few million hunting and gathering could support, exists because one woman in the Fertile Crescent noticed seeds growing where her tribe had camped and decided to try planting them herself. Her simple trick of selecting and planting the best seeds created the modern world. For better and worse, abundance and inequality, civilization and servitude, ASA, the eternal harvest of that first revolutionary spring,